Lieutenant Jackson's hand stayed frozen at his side as Colonel David Washington approached the base entrance, his polished boots clicking against the concrete with military precision. The 24-year-old officer's jaw tightened, his blue eyes scanning the black man in civilian clothes with unconcealed suspicion. The security checkpoint buzzed with tension as other personnel watched the standoff unfold. "I need to see some identification," Jackson said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "This is a restricted military installation." Colonel Washington reached slowly into his jacket pocket, his movements deliberate and measured. At 42, he had navigated these waters before, but something about the young lieutenant's defiant posture suggested this encounter would be different. The colonel's Silver Eagle insignia caught the morning sunlight as he withdrew his military ID, but Jackson barely glanced at it. "This could be fake," Jackson muttered, his prejudice masquerading as diligence. "I'm going to need you to step aside while I verify this." What Jackson didn't know was that Washington had just returned from a classified mission in Syria, where he had spent 3 months coordinating joint operations that saved hundreds of American lives. The colonel's uniform hung in his quarters, replaced by civilian clothes for his unscheduled return to Fort Brexton, base he had actually helped design during his previous assignment as Deputy Chief of Staff. The twist that would soon unfold began with Jackson's refusal to acknowledge the rank of a superior officer, but it would cascade into revelations about a missing weapons shipment, a cover-up involving Jackson's commanding officer, Major Reynolds, and Washington's real reason for this surprise inspection. The colonel's radio crackled to life in his pocket, and Jackson's face went pale as he recognized the voice of General Patricia Morrison, the base commander. Washington had been her mentor at West Point, and their conversation about the security breach he'd discovered would soon expose a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of the base command structure. Jackson's insubordination was about to trigger an investigation that would reveal not only his own complicity in overlooking suspicious activities, but also his role in harassing other minority personnel under the guise of enhanced security protocols. The morning sun beat down on the checkpoint as Washington remained calm, knowing that his next move would either resolve this peacefully or ignite a confrontation that would reshape the entire base. His phone showed 17 missed calls from the Pentagon, each one representing another piece of evidence in the case he'd been building for months. Jackson's refusal to salute wasn't just disrespect, it was the final thread that would unravel a conspiracy involving stolen military equipment, falsified reports, and a systematic pattern of discrimination that had been poisoning Fort Braxton's command structure for over 2 years. Washington reached for his radio with the same calm precision he'd used in countless combat situations. His finger found the emergency channel of frequency that would broadcast to every officer on the base simultaneously. The static crackled once before his voice cut through with commanding authority. "This is Colonel David Washington, service, number 774-2981. Requesting immediate assistance at Checkpoint Alpha. I am being detained by Lieutenant Jackson, despite proper identification and rank verification." Jackson's face drained of color as the implications hit him. The emergency frequency meant every senior officer within 50 miles had just heard his name associated with detaining a colonel. His hand moved instinctively toward his weapon, then stopped as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. "Sir, I was just following protocol. Stand down, Lieutenant." Washington's voice carried decades of command experience. "You've already compromised your position enough." The radio erupted with responses. Major Reynolds' voice came first, tight with panic. "Washington, this is Reynolds. What's your status?" Then General Morrison. "All units converge on checkpoint Alpha immediately. Full security alert." Within 90 seconds, the first Humvee arrived, followed by 3 more. Soldiers poured out their weapons ready, but their faces confused as they took in the scene. A lieutenant in full uniform standing rigidly at attention, and a black man in civilian clothes holding a radio like he owned the entire base. Captain Sarah Chen stepped forward, her eyes moving between the 2 men. She'd served under Washington in Afghanistan and recognized him instantly despite his civilian attire. "Colonel Washington, sir. What are your orders?" Jackson's world tilted. The respect in Chen's voice, the immediate deference of the arriving soldiers. The way everyone suddenly treated this man like he outranked them all. It painted a picture that destroyed every assumption he'd made. "I want Lieutenant Jackson's supervisor here immediately," Washington said, his tone measured, but carrying an edge that made everyone present stand straighter. "And I want a full review of this checkpoint's procedures for the past 6 months." The radio crackled again. "Washington, this is Morrison. I'm en route. Hold your position." Jackson's breathing became shallow. General Morrison, calling a colonel by his last name without rank, meant either extreme familiarity or that Washington held a position so high that normal protocol didn't apply. Either option spelled disaster for Jackson's career. General Morrison's convoy arrived with the efficiency of a military strike force, 3 black SUVs forming a protective perimeter around the checkpoint. The base commander emerged from the lead vehicle, her silver hair catching the light as she surveyed the scene with the sharp eyes of someone who'd spent 30 years turning chaos into order. "Colonel Washington, both respect and concern. I got your message about the security irregularities. Is this related to your investigation?" Jackson felt the ground shift beneath him. Investigation? What investigation? His eyes darted between the general and Washington, trying to piece together a puzzle whose dimensions he was only beginning to understand. Washington nodded grimly. "Among other things, Lieutenant Jackson here refused to acknowledge my rank and has detained me for 23 minutes without proper cause. I'd like to know if this represents standard operating procedure for your base. General, it most certainly does not." Morrison's gaze fixed on Jackson with laser intensity. "Lieutenant, you will report to my office at 0800 tomorrow for a full review of this incident. Until then, you're confined to quarters." Major Reynolds finally arrived, jogging from the parking area with the desperate look of a man trying to contain a disaster. His face went pale when he saw Washington and Jackson. Noticed the recognition and other piece of a puzzle he didn't understand. "Colonel, we weren't expecting you back until when, Major?" Washington's question cut through the air like a blade. "According to my orders, I was to report directly to General Morrison upon return from Syria." Those orders came from the Joint Chiefs themselves. Reynolds' Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. Jackson began to realize that his simple act of prejudice had triggered something much larger than a disciplinary hearing. This was about more than a missed salute or a delayed checkpoint entry. "Sir, if I may," Chen interjected. The lieutenant appeared to be following what he believed were standing orders. "Major Reynolds briefed us last week about increased security measures for unscheduled arrivals." Washington and Morrison exchanged a look that spoke volumes. Jackson caught the silent communication and felt his stomach drop. Whatever investigation Washington had mentioned, it apparently involved the very protocols Jackson thought he'd been following. "Major Reynolds," Morrison said, her voice carrying the authority of someone about to end careers, "I think it's time. We discussed those standing orders you've been implementing without my authorization." In Morrison's office 30 minutes later, the pieces began falling into place with devastating precision. Washington sat across from the general's desk, his civilian clothes now making perfect sense. He'd been working undercover, investigating reports of missing equipment and discriminatory practices that had reached the Pentagon through back channels. "Show him the files," Morrison said to her aide, who produced a thick folder marked "Confidential Eyes Only." Washington opened it to reveal photographs, documents, and recorded conversations that painted a picture of systematic corruption. Lieutenant Jackson's face appeared in several photos, always in the company of Major Reynolds and a group of officers who'd been flagged for suspicious activities. The missing equipment reports started 6 months ago. Small items at first night vision goggles, communication devices, ammunition. But the pattern suggested inside involvement. Morrison leaned forward. "We needed someone to investigate without alerting the perpetrators." Colonel Washington volunteered to return from his Syria deployment early and conduct surveillance. The files revealed a network of theft and resale that had been operating under the cover of Reynolds' enhanced security protocols. Jackson's aggressive screening of minority personnel had been part of a deliberate strategy to create an atmosphere where questioning authority was discouraged and irregularities went unreported. "Your checkpoint behavior this morning," Washington continued, "wasn't just prejudice, Lieutenant. It was part of a systematic pattern we've been documenting. You've been flagging and delaying minority personnel for extended searches while allowing Reynolds' associates to pass through with minimal inspection. Jackson's hands trembled as he reviewed surveillance photos showing him waving through vehicles that should have been searched, while minority service members were subjected to aggressive questioning and delays. The pattern was undeniable, and his participation was documented in excruciating detail. The radio call this morning, Morrison added, wasn't just about getting you to acknowledge rank, it was the signal we'd been waiting for to initiate arrests. Your public confrontation with Colonel Washington gave us the probable cause we needed to execute search warrants. Even as they spoke, military police were searching Reynolds' quarters. Jackson's belongings and the storage facilities were stolen. Equipment had been cached. The investigation that had begun with reports of discrimination had evolved into something much larger, a case involving theft of military property, violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and conspiracy. Washington's phone buzzed with updates from the search teams. They found it, he said simply. All of it. The base conference room had been transformed into a command center with evidence tables displaying recovered equipment worth over $2 million. Jackson sat at the far end of the table, his uniform stripped of insignia, flanked by two military police officers who'd read him his rights an hour earlier. Major Reynolds occupied a similar position at the opposite end, his face ashen as he stared at the mountain of evidence that had emerged from the searches. Night vision systems, encrypted radios, body armor, and even small arms were arranged in neat rows, each item tagged and photographed. 12 months, Washington said, addressing the room full of officers who'd been called in for the briefing. That's how long this operation has been running. And it succeeded because it hid behind a facade of enhanced security and patriotic duty. General Morrison stood before a presentation screen showing financial records, communication logs, and surveillance footage. The theft ring used Lieutenant Jackson's checkpoint harassment as cover. While he was conducting extended security screenings of minority personnel, creating delays and drawing attention, Major Reynolds and his associates were moving stolen equipment through alternate routes. The implications were staggering. Jackson's prejudice hadn't just been personal bias, had been weaponized as part of a criminal conspiracy. His aggressive treatment of Black and Hispanic service members had created a climate of fear that prevented witnesses from coming forward. While his selective enforcement of security protocols had provided operational cover for the theft ring, Colonel Washington's investigation, Morrison continued, revealed that complaints about discriminatory treatment had been systematically buried or dismissed. Minority personnel who reported harassment were transferred, disciplined, or had their service records flagged for minor infractions. Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez stepped forward to testify. Jackson remembered he'd subjected her to 3 separate vehicle searches in 1 week, claiming suspicious behavior. I tried to report the harassment, she said, her voice steady. Despite the weight of the moment, Major Reynolds told me I was being overly sensitive and that security required vigilance against all threats. Washington played recorded conversations that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy. Reynolds' voice came through the speakers. Keep the minorities busy with extra inspections. The more time they spend proving they belong here, the less attention they pay to what we're moving through the back gates. Jackson closed his eyes as the full magnitude of his complicity became clear. He'd thought he was being a good soldier, following orders and maintaining security. Instead, he'd been a tool in a criminal enterprise that had stolen from his own country and terrorized his fellow service members. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. Captain Chen entered the conference room carrying a laptop and a grim expression that suggested more revelations were coming. Colonel Washington, we found something else, she said, connecting the laptop to the main display. The financial investigation uncovered payments to Lieutenant Jackson, but not what you might expect. The screen showed bank records revealing that Jackson hadn't been paid for his participation in the theft ring. Instead, the money trail revealed something more complex and more damaging. He'd been receiving payments for falsified incident reports that supported the narrative of increased security threats from minority personnel. Every harassment complaint that was dismissed, Chen explained, generated a counter-report filed by Lieutenant Jackson alleging suspicious behavior by the complainant. These reports were used to justify the enhanced security measures that provided cover for the theft operation. Jackson's face went white as he realized the full scope of his manipulation. He hadn't just been a racist guard, he'd been systematically deceived into believing he was protecting the base from threats that didn't exist. Washington leaned forward, his voice carrying a mixture of authority and something that might have been pity. "Lieutenant, did Major Reynolds ever explain why you were specifically chosen for checkpoint duty?" he said. "He said I had good instincts for spotting trouble," Jackson whispered. "The truth is simpler and more disturbing," Washington replied. "You were chosen because psychological profiles indicated you were susceptible to racial bias and likely to follow orders without questioning their broader implications." The revelation hit Jackson like a physical blow. His prejudice hadn't been incidental to the conspiracy, it had been the foundation upon which the entire operation was built. Reynolds and his associates had identified, cultivated, and exploited his racism to create the perfect cover for their crimes. Morrison addressed the room with the finality of someone ending a chapter. "This investigation has revealed systemic failures in leadership, training, and oversight. But it has also demonstrated the courage of service members like Colonel Washington, who risked his career to expose the truth." She turned to Jackson, her voice carrying the weight of military justice. "Lieutenant, you have been manipulated and used, but that doesn't absolve you of responsibility for your actions. Your prejudice created real harm for real people, regardless of the criminal conspiracy that exploited it." 3 months later, Fort Braxton had been transformed. The systematic changes implemented after the investigation had created new protocols for reporting discrimination, independent oversight of security operations, and mandatory bias training for all personnel. Jackson stood in the base gymnasium, wearing civilian clothes as he addressed a room full of service members. His court-martial had resulted in a dishonorable discharge, but his cooperation with the investigation had led to a plea agreement that included community service and mandatory counseling. "I thought I was being a good soldier," he said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-learned lessons. "I thought following orders meant not asking questions. I was wrong on both counts." Colonel Washington sat in the front row, having returned to his regular duties after receiving a commendation for his undercover investigation. The stolen equipment had been recovered, the theft ring had been prosecuted, and Major Reynolds was serving a 15-year sentence in military prison. The investigation revealed that 12 service members had requested transfers due to harassment. Jackson continued. 7 others had received negative performance reviews after filing complaints. "I was responsible for creating an environment where fellow Americans couldn't serve their country with dignity." Staff Sergeant Gonzalez stood to address the group. "The hardest part wasn't the harassment itself, it was knowing that the system was designed to silence us. When Colonel Washington's investigation validated our experiences, it didn't just restore our faith in military justice. It reminded us why we serve." Washington took the podium for the final address. "This case demonstrates that discrimination isn't just morally wrong, it's a national security threat. When we allow prejudice to flourish, we create vulnerabilities that enemies of democracy can exploit." He looked directly at Jackson, who met his gaze without flinching. "But it also demonstrates the possibility of redemption." Lieutenant Jackson's testimony was crucial to exposing the full scope of the conspiracy. His willingness to confront his own bias and accept responsibility has contributed to systemic changes that will protect future service members. The ceremony concluded with the presentation of new guidelines for reporting discrimination and a moment of silence for the service members whose careers had been damaged by the conspiracy. Jackson shook hands with several people he had previously harassed. Conversations that represented small steps toward healing wounds that would take years to fully close. As the crowd dispersed, Washington approached Jackson one final time. "The civilian world will offer you opportunities to continue serving," he said simply. "How you use those opportunities will determine whether this experience becomes a cautionary tale or a redemption story." Jackson nodded, understanding that his real service to his country was just beginning. The base that had once been poisoned by his prejudice and Reynolds' corruption was now stronger, more vigilant, and more just. The investigation that had begun with a refused salute had ended with a renewed commitment to the principles that make military service meaningful: honor, integrity, and the protection of those who cannot protect themselves. The morning sun that had witnessed the initial confrontation now shone on a base where discrimination was no longer tolerated. where reporting harassment was encouraged rather than punished, and where the true meaning of military discipline, the discipline to do what's right even when it's difficult, had been restored through the courage of those willing to stand up for justice.